Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel in homage to Leo Panitch, the great Canadian socialist whom we've lost last year. Before we begin, I want to remind you first, or explain a little bit how we're going to proceed here. So first of all, the panel is going to be in English. If you need interpretation, translation to French, you can click on the bottom right part of your screen on the little globe there, interpretation, interprétation, and then you get to get translation to French. We're going to have three panelists who are going to tell us about Leo and his work and his life. And then we're going to have a Q&A. And my understanding is that if you have a question or comment to make, you can click on the little Q and R, just beside the little globe at the bottom of your screen. You can write down your question. Paulo is here to help us, and he's gonna send me the question. I'm gonna read it to the panelists. Okay. So I'm Xavier Lafrance. I'm a member of Québec Solidaire, also a political science professor at UQAM. I'm going to be your host for the day. So before I introduce the three panelists that we have with us today, I really want to just say something real quickly about Leo. So Leo died last year. He had been diagnosed with multiple myelomas and had contracted coronavirus while in the hospital receiving treatment. Leo was widely recognized and appreciated Canadian socialist, activist, thinker, and political science professor at York University. He did his PhD at the London School of Economics under the supervision of British Marxist Ralph Miliband, with whom he edited the yearly journal, the Socialist Register, a project that he continued to manage for over 2 decades after Miliband's death, with the help of Colin Leys and Greg Albo. Leo has published several books and articles on state theory, political economy, US imperialism, and socialist strategy, among many other topics. In 2013, in collaboration with his lifelong comrade Sam Gindin, who's with us today, he's going to speak in a minute, he published a seminal book titled The Making of Global Capitalism. I'm not going to say much because we have great panelists, as I say, who've met, struggled with, and known Leo in different contexts, and will doubtless offer rich reflection on his many contributions to the socialist left. I just want to say this real quick. I met Leo at York University's Department of Political Science in the mid-2000s. This department was and is still to some extent known as the mecca of academic Marxism and critical social sciences, broadly speaking. Over the last 3 decades, it has been one of the best, and I've heard different people for whom I have great respect suggest that maybe it has actually been the best critical political science department of the world. It's up there. I'll let you decide. Leo is probably the single most important, as far as I know, figure in building the critical edge of this department that have trained several generations of critical and Marxist scholars that are now teaching in different parts of the world. But what made Leo's academic accomplishments at York so important and meaningful was the fact that they were never simply meant to be academic accomplishments per se. All of his academic production and activities were guided by his socialist engagement beyond and outside academia. They were deeply connected. Since I graduated from York, I've had the chance to travel to Britain, Greece, the US to try and witness and learn from the recent renewal of the socialist left. And more often than not, I would bump into Leo. He was truly an internationalist socialist thinker that learned from and offered critical reflections and solidarity to several movements, parties, and activists in the countries that I just named, but also in South Africa and Brazil and elsewhere. Now, you don't have to agree with everything that Leo had to say to realize that he made an incredibly rich and important contribution that is and will be crucial for the debates that will be guiding the renewal of the socialist left in years to come. So, to discuss Leo's life and work, we have three great panelists with us today. We're going to start in a minute with Sam Gindin. He's a Canadian socialist and union activist and co-author of many works with Leo. Next, we're going to have Ursula Hughes, who's professor of labor and globalization at the University of. No, it changed. Well, I'll let you correct me. That's the information that I had. I'm sorry about that. She's also that's a fact, an author of many articles and books, really important contributions such as Labor under Contemporary Capitalism, which you should definitely check out. And then at last, we're going to have Megan Day, who's a journalist for Jacobin and a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. You're each going to have 15 minutes. Pay attention to Paulo's going to try to tell you about the time. And then we're going to have a Q&A. So Sam, I'll let you begin.
Okay, thanks a lot, Xavier. You actually touched on some of the things I really wanted to start with. I want to say something about Leo as a teacher and public intellectual before I go into his the intellectual ideas that were so influential. When Leo had his last class at York, he invited me to sit in. And after the class was over and I had watched Leo just sitting there beaming through the whole class, he turned to me. This is after everybody had gone, and he said, "I never realized before how much I love teaching." And that love of teaching was absolutely fundamental to what Leo was. He loved to see undergrads open their eyes to other possibilities. He loved, as Xavier was pointing out, to see his grads become independent, creative Marxists that would also challenge him. He thrived on interviews and forums where he could challenge the existing common sense and aggressively argue for an alternative common sense. And he was an activist intellectual. Again, as Xavier was saying, he was there with Momentum, he was there with DSA and Jacobin, he was there in Syriza. One of the first notes I got after he died was from the MST in Brazil and from the South Africans. And the point of Leo wasn't just that he had the natural skills for it. He was confident, as he would often say, he had the gift of gab. But as a socialist, he really genuinely loved to see the development of people. And it wasn't just kind of a political development. He just loved to see them develop as full and thoughtful thinkers. And of course, he had a message, which was absolutely critical. He wasn't just trying to pass anything on. He had a particular message about socialism and his own role in democratizing knowledge and a very activist role in advancing the cause of socialism. A few of the general things before I get into specifics was he had a fundamental commitment to a ruthless criticism of all that exists, but in a constructive way. In spite of the conflicts he had with others, Leo was never sectarian. The second thing is that Leo took the historical and historical materialism seriously at all kinds of dimensions. He understood that the struggle was long-term. He understood that capitalism is still developing. He understood that socialism will be a long process. And he understood that history wasn't just something about time and the past, but something to learn from. And then, of course, fundamental to everything was his interest in going beyond academic ideas, but seriously looking at the questions of agency, social agency, political agency, the site of struggle, and the question of both personal transformation and collective transformation. I'm going to address three things: the state, class, and party. And in thinking about the state, Leo was adamant about the fact that states were authors, not victims of globalization, The state was the critical site of struggle. Protest wasn't enough because protest couldn't change things like limit the flow of capital or deal with free trade. And the role of states was to make globalization within their own territory. That is, to create the conditions within their own territory for global accumulation. Without states, this couldn't happen. The second aspect of a state theory that I think was so crucial was the notion of the transformation of the state. It wasn't just a question of coming into power. It wasn't just a question of using the state in different ways. It was an appreciation that it was a capitalist state. And by capitalist state, this didn't refer to who was in it, but that over a century and a half, 2 centuries, it had developed the capacities to administer a capitalist society. And it didn't have the capacities to address a socialist society. So the critical question of revolution wasn't coming to government, but it was the question of, could we, coming into government, transform the state? That was the revolutionary question. And any government that came into power had 3 questions that it had to confront. One was, how do you govern a capitalist society in a more progressive way that gives things to people that they hadn't had before? Second is this question of transforming the state so you could go further than just governing a capitalist society better. And third, which I'll get to in a minute, was the need to build the working class base, the social force that could act as a check on even a sympathetic government, that could both push things, so any government didn't have the excuse of, well, you have to wait, but at the same time had patience and understood that, and this was part of their class consciousness, that this was a long-term struggle. One of the questions this raises is, well, isn't this a bit state-centric? What about internationalism? And of course, as a socialist, and based on how Xavier described his activity all around the world, socialism is universal. Winning it in any country is incomplete. But, and this is critical, we cannot make a contribution to international socialism unless we can build a base nationally. There are, of course, all kinds of things that we can do at specific moments, but if we can't show that we can build unity across identities, across public sector workers and private sector workers, that we can get over unions competing to unionize workers and more concerned with dues than building the class, unless we can do that, we're not going to be able to contribute very much to international socialism. In fact, what happened in the 70s was, when global corporations were rising, unions in North America and elsewhere, when they talked about dealing with globalization, what they really meant was extending business unionism to the international level. And it isn't what we needed. We needed the kind of class power that could support the development of class power elsewhere, that could actually be strong enough to say, we want to cancel their debt, or we want to transfer technology to them. And Marx had this right back in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels. He said that internationalism, the struggle is always international in substance, which basically means that if you're fighting in one country, it creates space for struggles elsewhere. And if you're giving up things in one country, you're undermining struggles elsewhere. But even though it was international in substance, it was always national in form. Where you organized and where you had to take on the state as the center, the concentrated center of capitalist power, was at the national level. You had to come to terms with, as Marx put it, your own bourgeoisie first. So class stands at the center of all of this. Any successful political strategy for the left has to be rooted in attempts to develop working class agency and capacities. And this is something that Leo absolutely understood. And it was, all of his work revolved around this question. And this was for the obvious reasons that Marx had always emphasized. The workplace is a site of building community. It's where workers have some organization and resources. It's where they have the potential for sustained disruptive power as opposed to just protest. And key to understanding workers and this is another point that Leo always emphasized, is not to be essentialist. Workers had all kinds of contradictions. They were neither inherently good nor inherently bad. And under capitalism, there were all these pressures to undermine their potential strength. Just trying to survive under capitalism meant you tended to look short-term or tended to be pragmatic. Your daily experience left you dependent on the corporation. Workers were exhausted in terms of reading and being active in other ways. And above all, it wasn't a class. They were fragmented. And even when they won things, they tended to be integrative. When workers won the right to vote, it meant that their focus shifted to the state and integration into the state as a vehicle for making success within capitalism. And when they won the right to trade unionism, it was similar. It was a crucial success, but it also meant a notion of we can win things through struggling with our own corporation, which at particular moments was true, and then lost that truth. And unions as an organization of the working class, their main organization, were particularist. They're not class organizations. They're organizations of workers who happen to be in the same workplace and are struggling for the common interests in that workplace. And therefore, they're not class institutions nor socialist institutions, but they have openings. On the one hand, to be effective, workers have to start becoming centers of working class life. For practical reasons, they have to think in terms of class. Simply, in terms of organizing something like Amazon, we have to think in terms of how can we actually cooperate to do something so massive rather than compete and have a plan and a focus that can actually win. And the other thing is that to win battles, workers need some analysis of the enemy. So it means that there is an opening to start thinking about analyzing capitalism as what they face, and that creates an opening for raising questions of socialism. The last thing I just want to highlight about class is the question of class and identity, because this has been so divisive. And the argument that I'd make and that Leo always made was class is the foundation for really building unity, as opposed to being fragmented either in terms of particular identities or particular issues or particular workplaces. It was the space, it was the key to building unity, but there was a catch. And that catch was, if we really want class unity, we had to appreciate all the fragmentation and all the differences within the class and recognize everybody in that class as fundamentally, in a qualitative sense, equal. And not just recognize them rhetorically, but have a commitment to fight for, actively fight for their equality within the class, both in society and within our own institutions. Okay, if the class isn't inherently revolutionary, it raises the question of how it becomes so. And that required a party. It required a specific organization that wasn't just involved in protest or struggles, but was a very specialized space that was concerned with strategy, debate, discussion, education of cadre and education and mass education, continuity in our memories and what we've learned, how to sustain the struggle, its continuity. The party is that kind of a particular space. Now, what I'd really emphasize about this is the main role of the party at this moment in time isn't to develop the capacity to take power. We're just nowhere close to it. The key challenge for us is how do we actually make workers into a class that is coherent, confident, independent of capital, has its own vision, is becoming organizers both individually and collectively, and mass educators. And just to quote Leo, socialists need to be permanently engaged in teaching people how to be organizers and in developing its members' own political education so they can work at the base to engage in what needs to be seen as class reformation today. And when Leo said that, people agreed, but I think what they didn't appreciate enough is he was emphasizing that this is the key issue. Coming to power is something that only matters, to governance, I should say, that only matters if we've really built at the base. And it's the absence of the base that has undermined the left, in whether we're talking about Greece, Britain, South Africa, the US, Brazil, anywhere. Now, I want to say a few things very quickly about class strategy, because we have to think of class strategy within capitalism. What do we do in terms of winning reforms, but also thinking beyond reforms and moving further? And some of this is populist. I mean, I think an emphasis on wealth inequality is a populist demand, but it highlights on a continuing basis the inequality of the society in a populist way. And it kind of preempts the struggle we're going to be in soon, which is going to be, how do we pay for everything that happened in the pandemic, but also for the environment and improving infrastructure, et cetera. And it preempts it by saying, yes, we're going to have to pay for it with massive redistributions amongst wealth. I'd argue that it also means taxing the working class within that context, but that's another issue. The more important thing I want to emphasize strategically is that we have to find ways of carving out spaces within capitalism that are crucial to winning things and winning crucial battles and point us towards socialism. And I want to emphasize three elements of that. One is the environment. We cannot fix the environment, and I think there's a really clear basis for this, by leaving it to competition, profits, and the kind of values that emerge out of capitalism. It has to be something that is collective, that involves planning, that is democratic, and that is based on completely different values. And that gives us a chance to create a space, a really large space, because dealing with the environment isn't just about fixing something or moving from oil to electricity. It means changing everything about how we live, how we work, how we travel, what we value. So the environment is a crucial space, not just because it's important in itself and raises question of economic restructuring, but it challenges the fundamental logic of capitalism within capitalism and builds to go beyond it. The second thing is the public sector itself is already a large sector, and it's under attack because obviously under capitalism, the hegemony of capital means that it's going to be limited in terms of, there's going to be all kinds of pressures for commercialization, for privatization, for not setting standards that go beyond what happens in the private sector. But the key for us isn't only expanding the public sector, including public ownership, but democratizing it. We have to show through a fight over, well, what are the values the public sector is actually going to focus on? How is it going to relate to its so-called clients? What role are workers going to have other than saying, well, we elected a progressive government and therefore maybe that means we can have higher wages? So raising these kinds of questions in the public sector, including when we have examples of public ownership, is fundamental for both reform and for building. And the final thing is we can't change things unless we take on finance. And the left has talked a lot about things like breaking up finance, which I think serves no useful purpose. I think, a financial sector that's just more competitive is going to be more unstable, and it's going to have more pressures on people. And simply saying we need a public bank is also going to be a problem, because then it has to raise its funds and it has to be competitive in terms of getting returns. What we need is a financial system, and we're not strong enough to take it over yet, but what we can start thinking about are green banks or infrastructure banks that get their funds independently of the market and then allocate those funds in a democratic way that is constructive to our goals. And what I mean by getting their funds independently is that we have a levy on every financial institution based on everything we keep giving these financial institutions and getting some of it back so that these new public institutions don't have to enter competitive markets to do it. So I'm just going to conclude by, I just want to read something. It was the last paragraph of something that is just coming out that I wrote about Leo. Just take me a minute. Leo, the sober optimist and the anti-utopian utopian, struggled with the contradiction between the time scale of our lives and the time scale of socialism. But it did not deter him. He died as angry as ever over what capitalism did to human potentials, and as determined as ever to search for how we might best respond. What could be better than to live life as if socialism was possible? What could be more meaningful than to enjoy one's life in all its rich dimensions, while also working with comrades to contribute to the eventual achievement of an egalitarian, truly democratic world that only others will see? Can one get any closer to immortality than this? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. This is great. Thank you. Ursula, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. I wish Sam could have spoken longer and I could speak less, because it's so great to hear him speak about Leo. I was planning to speak about Leo under sort of three headings: Leo the intellectual, and Leo the socialist, and Leo the human being. But the more I thought about it, the more impossible it is to separate all those things. They were all bundled together. He was a man without partitions. You know, his warmth as a human being extended into his intellectual life, and his socialism extended into his intellectual life, and his intellectual life pervaded everything. So it's very, very difficult to sort of unbundle those things and talk about them separately. But I'm going to try a little bit. I think it's difficult for people who knew Leo and sort of, if you like, got used to him being there over the years. It's hard to remember how incredibly atypical he was, how unusual he was, compared with any other Marxist academic that anyone can think of. He had an enormous and comprehensive knowledge. He read voraciously, right up to the end of his life. He was constantly finding obscure things to read in obscure places. You would suddenly get an email saying, "Hey, have you read this? What do you think of this?" And you know, he was constantly reading new things and sharing the ideas with everybody. But there was not one iota of that kind of competitive, these are my ideas, those are your ideas, I cite you, you cite me, this intellectual property belongs to me. You know, that kind of stuff that goes on in universities and is like the normal experience of academic life. It just wasn't there with Leo. His intellect kind of flowered in collaboration. I mean, his collaboration with Sam was probably decades long, probably the most important. And I mean, to everybody else, pretty seamless. You didn't know which ideas were whose. It was like the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. But he also worked closely in collaboration with others. The Socialist Register was the product, if you like, of a series of collaborations with Colin Lees, and then more recently with Greg Albo. And he had this ability to reach out to other serious socialist intellectuals around the world, as Sam said, in a very, very non-sectarian way, and engage in dialogue with them. You know, he didn't flatter or fawn to people, however famous they might be. He was always, you know, he criticized what he didn't agree with, but he built these extraordinary intellectual bridges and kind of, if you like, was a kind of glue that held together a global assemblage of important Marxist intellectuals. And the Socialist Register was the embodiment of that. And, you know, there are, of course, other socialist journals around, like New Left Review and Historical Materialism and so on. But I don't think anything touches Socialist Register for its kind of non-sectarian Catholic embracing of different ideas, of placing them alongside each other, and of saying, I mean, what Leo, sometimes we used to argue with him. He would say, oh, we're thinking of inviting Zizek to write something for the next register. And I would go, what, Zizek? You can't be serious, you know. And he'd say, yes, but he wrote this really interesting thing and it needs to be heard, you know. And this openness to different people's ideas and forming judgments about what needed to be heard, I think was enormously important in keeping socialist theory alive, particularly during that long period from the 80s, really up until the financial crisis, when sort of postmodernism and post-structuralism ruled the roost and everything was relative. And York University, as Xavier said in his introduction, was a great center globally, perhaps the only center that kept serious, unsectarian Marxist thinking alive during that dark period. Well, in my opinion, dark period. Of course, you know, good things came out of it, as they always do. So I think Leo the intellectual is an extraordinarily important person, and it's difficult to describe how it is that he managed to occupy. I mean, you know, he was a significant figure. He had a lot of charisma. He could attract an audience and keep an audience's attention, and he, you know, had all the makings of a sort of major public figure, but somehow there was a sort of lack of ego in it because he always gave space to other people. I sometimes think he must have been very much loved as a small child to have such a strong sense of his own identity without any need to sort of throw his ego around and drown out other speakers. So I think that kind of intellectual praxis is something we can all learn an awful lot from. It's astonishingly rare because the culture of neoliberal universities makes it almost impossible to be like that. You need to be such a strong person, I think, as Leo was, to pull that off. But that kind of openness to different ideas while keeping a rigorous analysis didn't just characterize his relationship with other intellectuals, if you like. It also characterized his relationship with socialists, including working class socialists and trade unionists. There was a kind of generosity of spirit in that if, you know, he was talking to someone and he, you know, someone like me, for instance, you know, I would clearly be talking about something he knew a lot more about than I did, and I would say something that was perhaps rather silly, which a trade, you know, could equally be a worker on a picket line or something like that. He would never put you down. He would add the extra information that might help you understand the situation a little bit better, but kind of praise you for what you had got right. You know, it was very encouraging. And I imagine he was like that with his students as well. I never saw him teach, but a kind of encouraging people to think and to express what they thought and to not slap it down, but to nevertheless not be uncritical about it, because he could be very, you know, he could be very critical if you said something he thought was silly. I had one or two major stand-ins with him over issues like, you know, classic Marxist problems like, you know, are public sector workers productive workers or not, and things like that. But basically that kind of I mean, it's a bit of a cliche to say it's kind of like a Gramscian thing, like, you know, the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect. But he did really, in a way, kind of live that, because as Sam said, he had no illusions that the revolution was around the corner or that, you know, workers were ready to sort of leap into kind of socialist action. He knew that it was going to be a long, hard struggle, but that never stopped him being completely optimistic in his approach to any particular struggle, and giving it whatever support he could and giving it whatever guidance he could, but also drawing on his networks to put people in touch with others internationally, as well as within the national working class, so to speak. But as I said at the beginning, it's quite hard to disentangle how he was as a socialist and how he was as an intellectual with how he was as a human being, which was an enormously kind and nurturing. His grad students, I think, became his friends. You know, you would go around to his house and they'd be invited for dinner, or they'd be pouring out their troubles, or he would be suggesting who they could go and stay with when they went to such and such a place. And there was this a kind of inseparable connection, really, between his personal warmth and kindness and generosity and his socialist politics and his intellectual life. What can we say? Wouldn't it be great if more people could live their lives in such a kind of unified way, if you like, without having to compartmentalize the kinds of things you say at work and this kind of things you write in an academic paper and the kind of things you say to your kids and the kind of things you say to your friends. He had this ability to use the same voice for all these things, which is what made him such a great communicator and he was always sought out for television interviews and things like that. Whenever there was a major development around the world, you could be sure that some Canadian newspaper or TV company would seek him out for an interview because he always had something intelligent to say about it. I think I've said enough, really. I think I'm just going to kind of rant on, and I ought to give the floor to people who perhaps have a more structured contribution to make. So I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really great. Thank you, Ursula. And now, Megan Day.
Hi, so I'm Megan Day. I'm a staff writer at Jacobin Magazine. I first met Leo actually just a few years ago at a conference in Montreal called The Great Transition. You may have heard of it. So I'm a latecomer to knowing Leo, but you know, he decided right off the bat that I would be a good candidate for his mentorship, as he did for so many other young socialists. And I heard from him often throughout what ended up being the final years of his life. Some of you actually may have been present the day that Leo and I met. So Xavier had invited me to speak on a panel alongside representatives from various international socialist parties and organizations, including Podemos, France Insoumise, Québec Solidaire, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and I was asked to represent DSA. And specifically, per the organizer's request, I was asked to speak about the political perspective in the organizing work of the Bread and Roses caucus of DSA, which I'm a part of, and which the New York Times once accurately described as basically Marxist. So I came and I reported on what the Bread and Roses caucus in my local chapter of DSA, which at the time was the East Bay chapter in California, comprising, you know, Oakland and Berkeley and everything east of San Francisco. What we'd been up to. And in particular, I told the story of how we had run a pretty impressive electoral campaign for a Black socialist working class activist named Javanka Beckles to get her into the State House. And then how she unfortunately lost, but instead of dismantling our infrastructure when she lost, it was pretty narrow. We just quickly repurposed it and put our volunteers and resources to use. And we had planned this in advance on a strike solidarity campaign when the teachers in Oakland went on strike a few months later. And all of that was conducted under the political leadership of the Bread and Roses caucus, which at that point was both the majority of the formal leadership, and I think also probably the hegemonic political force in the East Bay chapter. So I explained how this activity put our politics into practice, the idea that we would run class struggle oriented campaigns, but we would see them as vehicles for building independent socialist and working class power, which wouldn't be restricted to the parliamentary sphere. And we would try to build a kind of mutually reinforcing relationship between our electoral work, our labor solidarity work, our political education, our democratic organization building, and so on, kind of holistic, a holistic approach to integrating electoral work into our other organizing. So around the time that I'm explaining all of that, I heard a voice booming in the audience, bravo, and clapping. And I nearly laughed out loud because it's very unusual for an event like this to be interrupted by someone shouting bravo and clapping at you. That feels good. And of course, that person was Leo, and he came up to me afterward and we got to know each other, and we spent the rest of the evening talking. And after that, I heard from him often, and I was frequently invited on panels and podcasts with him at his urging. And that's by no means an experience exclusive to me. So as many of you know, Leo relished the opportunity to mentor young socialists, especially those not just in Canada, but in the United States, specifically involved in Jacobin magazine and in DSA, and I think particularly the Bread and Roses caucus of DSA. And then in the UK, people associated with Tribune, which is related to Jacobin, and also, Momentum, the formation inside of the British Labour Party. So the last time I spoke in person to Leo was on one such panel, a panel where he had sort of invited me. He had told the organizers that he would like for me to appear, and that's how that happened. And he challenged me on this panel in a way that I find very characteristic and revealing. And I'll echo something that Ursula said, which is that the way that he would challenge you would always be like incredibly loving and encouraging. So I had been waxing poetic about the, expansive and unprecedented feeling of empowerment and of living in history that American socialists and working class activists had experienced at the dramatic height of the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. So I'd been in Nevada with a team of organizers for the Bernie campaign. And now that the campaign is over, I can be a little more candid about what exactly this small team was doing there. We were actually sneaking around these massive hotel casinos and stealing moments out of managers' view to talk to workers about showing up for Bernie at the upcoming special caucuses that were being held for hotel and casino workers on the Las Vegas Strip. And in particular, we were making an extra effort to talk to them about how guaranteed universal health coverage would actually be better than their pretty decent union health coverage, which was a message that the union itself, unfortunately, was actually trying to squash and undermine. They'd been passing out literature saying, don't vote for Bernie, he wants to take away your union health care with his Medicare for All plan, right? So this was the project. And then, Bernie won the Nevada caucus. He won it with the decisive support of the large white and Latino working class in Nevada, and including those workers on the Las Vegas Strip. It was a blowout for Bernie on the Las Vegas Strip. And we felt like we were on cloud nine. I mean, everyone who was in Las Vegas for the Bernie campaign will tell you about this radiant full rainbow that appeared in the sky after Bernie won the Nevada caucus, right? So I'm telling this story and I finished telling it, and then Leo says something like, I love how Megan always talks with the passion of an activist, but missing from her account is that if Bernie Sanders had won the presidential election, the American left would be in deep trouble, which is of course entirely true, right? He was right. Bernie Sanders would have been, if he had won, which of course would have been the best case scenario. I mean, it was what we were going for. There would have been no point in throwing our lot in with Bernie Sanders if it hadn't been credible and a good idea, right? But if he'd won, he would have been responsible for administering the capitalist state while attempting to transform it. He would have faced retaliation from capital in the form of economically devastating disinvestment. He would have received either no support or faced outright sabotage from other parts of the state, including the security state and the military, the bulk of his own party, the entirety of the other party, and so on. And plus, Sanders would not have risen to power through the ranks of a mass movement for democratic socialism, right? Because we don't really have that. Instead, he would have been tasked with engineering one from the White House that is building the base in the face of all of this opposition. Could have worked, right? Could have gone horribly wrong also. So this was a persistent theme of Leo's intellectual contributions, which Sam touched on. And it's the idea that the left has to make every effort to organize and take state power. But we should also understand that the nature of the state under capitalism makes the administration of socialist politics extraordinarily difficult in the beginning stages of the transition to socialism. And that means that we have to proceed strategically and intelligently. And above all, we have to proceed with the aim of developing the independent capacities of the working class to defend its gains and govern society in its own interests in the face of incredible opposition and the recalcitrance of the capitalist state. So convincing people to put us into power isn't easy, as we found. Nevertheless, it's actually easier than wielding state power once we've won it in a way that actually moves us towards socialism. So in other words, what I take from Leo's contributions, I have sort of 4 criteria for how we would wield power. One, in a way that forgoes the bureaucratic or technocratic path in favor of a deep democratic approach that fosters working class initiative and that builds the class's capacities, networks, organizations, and so on. And to this point, I think Leo was incredibly critical both of the sort of technocratic, social democratic parties in power in Europe, which basically said to the working class, don't worry, we'll take it off your hands and we'll sort of tinker around and make life marginally better for you, but you just go back to doing what you're doing. And then of course on a different powerful strain in 20th century socialism, which would be Stalinism, right? The sort of outright political repression and squashing of political dissent. Both of these create scenarios in which working class people are not permitted to develop their democratic capacities and are not permitted to learn how to govern, right? So the second criteria is that obviously we need to wield power in a way that's ideologically clear and convincing and that promotes a socialist perspective and that elevates class consciousness, which is extremely difficult to do when you're tasked at first with managing the complex affairs of capitalist society. You're not going to do it overnight. So how do you make sure that the house of cards doesn't fall down while also making it clear that the reason why the house of cards is constructed in such a precarious way is precisely because we need to scrap it and rebuild it. It's hard to do. I think the best examples from history are perhaps you could look to like Allende and Chile for an example of both trying to hold everything together while also making it clear that if things are not binding together perfectly, it's not democratic socialism's fault, right? It's capitalism's fault. And then 3, I think the third criteria is that we need to wield power in a way that stands up to capital and to finance, but also maintains the support and morale of the working class in the event that capital's inevitable retaliation causes conditions to worsen. So that's connected to the second criteria. And then the fourth, and I take this from Leo and Sam's work, is that in order to accomplish all of this, we have to have a state that is staffed by competent and politically aligned personnel, which is not easy when you don't have a mass movement that's already producing tons of cadre. And so even then, it tends to create a problem of sucking all the cadre into the state and leaving the extra parliamentary infrastructure in complete shambles. This was something that we talked about, when it looked like, oh my God, maybe Bernie's going to pull it off. We were like, well, who's going to fill the White House? And we were looking at each other like, are we gonna do it? Jesus Christ. Well, then who's gonna write for Jacobin? So this is a classic problem. So these, and of course, then if it wasn't us doing it, it was gonna be people who actually didn't share Bernie Sanders's political vision, which was gonna pose its own problems. So these warnings didn't mean, of course, that Leo was unsupportive of the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States or of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party in the UK. On the contrary, as anyone who he was incredibly supportive. He was thrilled even, and he tended to gravitate toward young socialists who threw our lot in with Sanders and Corbyn. And he understood that these initiatives were creating new socialist organizing opportunities and new socialist organizers who were dedicated to seizing them. For example, I told you at the beginning about all of those East Bay DSA organizers who launched this incredibly impressive strike solidarity effort. I'd be willing to say, I'm biased because I was a part of it, that it was probably the largest scale and most impressive strike solidarity effort initiated by socialists specifically in recent American labor history. Well, where did we all meet each other? We met each other after the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? That's how we ended up in the same room together, coming up with ideas to do things like this. And so that was not lost on Leo, despite his warnings. And furthermore, I think that Leo felt that despite the great difficulty that a Sanders presidency would have faced in fulfilling its promises to workers, which is due less to his own theoretical shortcomings than to like the objective balance of class forces, it still had the potential overall to move the political project in the right direction in terms of creating new political realities, upping political stakes, laying bare class conflict, and so on. Like, in other words, a Bernie Sanders presidency might have set us on a new and better path, even if it might have been incredibly messy in the meantime. And in fact, and I think that in fact, getting on a new and better path for the left in Leo's view had to be a complicated process due to the intractable nature of the capitalist state. And I think furthermore that Leo felt that even just the effort alone to win a Bernie presidency, even though unsuccessful, was a net positive. It sort of rejuvenated the United States socialist left after years of disorganization, ideological confusion, and lots of bad habits bred in obscurity and marginality. So these were some of the main themes of Leo's writing. I can hear them echoed also in what Sam and Ursula said. I think we're all in agreement. And I think he emphasized time and again the importance of preparing for the difficulties ahead by seriously attempting to understand how capitalism functions and how the capitalist state operates, both intentionally and just reflexively, to maintain it. And I think he also, I want to emphasize again something that Sam said, which is that Leo was big on emphasizing the necessity of preparing for this transition by orienting our activities toward class formation. So as his British friend and mentee Max Shanley put it on a recent podcast, the podcast was hosted by Grace Blakely, who's another one of Leo's friends and mentees in Britain. He had lots of young friends and mentees in Britain and the United States and Canada. But as Max put it, Leo viewed class not just as a thing, but as a process, constantly being organized and disorganized and reorganized. Of course, that doesn't mean that class can simply be anything that we decide to call class, right? It has real objective dimensions. Specifically under capitalism, some people don't own the means of production, which means that they have to sell their labor to those who do in exchange for a wage, which they use to purchase the means of their own survival. And then those who do own the means of production appropriate the surplus value of that labor as profit, which allows them to survive without selling their labor for less than what it's worth. And that is the material basis of class under capitalism. But the working class as a political subject does not spring fully formed from this state of affairs. And transforming it from a class in itself to a class for itself, as Marx would say, is the ultimate political objective that should dictate what kinds of activities we undertake. I'm running out of time, but I'll wrap up here and say that this is an incredible contribution. Class formation reframes and recasts many of the left's usual circular debates. So for example, in view of class formation, we can't really just say that electoral politics is either worthless or worthwhile, which is just a constant debate that people are having on the left. Rather, we can say that the kinds of electoral politics that takes as its aim the cultivation of mass class consciousness, the knitting together of working class people into new political arrangements, and the development of the working classes' organizational capacity and leadership capacity, all of that is a worthwhile way to do electoral politics. And any left project to win or wield state power that neglects those objectives is more or less worthless, or at the very least, it will eventually hit an impasse. I'll add one more thing, which is that Leo was really good at neither moralizing about nor ignoring the current class composition of socialist movements in advanced capitalist democracies, which, as you know, tend to be less representative of the broader working class in terms of like education, wages, job security, and other aspects of the class experience, right? The term that people use often to refer to DSA members is college-educated, downwardly mobile, middle-class millennials, right? It doesn't apply to every DSA member, but we have to be honest, the trend is broadly accurate. But in Leo's telling, this is not like it's not a source of personal embarrassment. It doesn't mean that our project is sort of bankrupt, or that we're all, as people like to say, cosplay socialists, or that we're just, trying to piss off our parents or whatever people say. No, of course not. But nor is it an acceptable long-term state of affairs, right? We can't get used to it given the urgency of class formation and the role of working class socialists in providing leadership to other members of the class. So this was another persistent theme of his counsel, and his remedy for this is the idea that socialists need to be embedded into the working class. Socialist organizations need to be embedded into the working class, in unions and workplaces, but also in the cultural sphere and in the institutions of daily working class life. And for that reason, he was very enthusiastic and told us often about the Bread and Roses caucus's embrace of the rank and file strategy to transform unions by sending socialists into them as members who can exhibit, and I think often more importantly, who can, recognize and cultivate working class leadership on the shop floor, right? And he thought, we had our work cut out for us, to put it lightly. But I think he appreciated that the caucus takes seriously the need to root socialists, individual socialists, and socialist organizations deeper into the working class rather than satisfying ourselves with a kind of degree of separation. I could talk forever about the many other themes of Leo's work. I regret that I don't have the time to go into the role of parties in facilitating class formation. It's a major hot button issue in the DSA, which is trying to figure out what kind of proto-party type entity it actually is. But in the interest of time, I know that I need to stop there. And I think that even that is just enough to think about for a lifetime in any case. I will end finally by saying that the American socialist movement is much better off for Leo's intellectual leadership. I'm very honored to have known him for a short time, and I'm very proud to be a socialist in the intellectual tradition that he represents, which extends, back through his own friend and mentor, Ralph Miliband. And the formations that I'm personally most dedicated to, Bread and Roses and Jacobin, both owe an enormous debt to this intellectual tradition and to Leo's guidance in particular. And to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, I'll say that I really hope that one day the United States socialist movement will advance enough to be able to take power and inevitably make a big, complicated mess of everything, and precisely the way that Leo Panitch warned us about. I believe that when this happens, we'll be much better prepared to minimize and withstand the messiness of the transition process than we ever hoped to be without his invaluable writing and his guidance and his companionship.
Thank you very much, Megan, for this. Thank you. That was great. Now, I'm going to open the floor to folks who would like to ask questions to the panelists, or maybe comment or share some of their personal experiences, maybe knowing Leo, or any thoughts that you might have on the importance of his work. I have a question here that I can see from Ujdia Merin for Megan. I'm going to read it. Oh, and by the way, I'm told that translators would appreciate if we could just slow down a little bit the pace of your talking, just so that they can do the best job possible. So here's the question. When we say socialists need to be embedded in the working class, does it mean that we cannot envisage working class itself being part of the socialists? Megan?
First, yeah, I apologize for talking too fast. That is a habit that I have. I will speak slower.
I did not name you, Megan, but you have this incredible ability to pack so much in a sentence. I've never seen that in my whole life. But anyway, you were not targeted by the comment personally. Go ahead.
Well, I do think I'll speak slower. So this is advice specifically for socialists, that socialists should embed ourselves in the working class, not just as individuals. I think more importantly, our organizations need to be better embedded in the working class. But to the spirit of the question, it's absolutely true that this doesn't just go one way. The truth of the matter is that we need to merge this movement for democratic socialism with any and all expressions of working class militancy. This has always been true. And in fact, the Social Democratic Party in Germany actually used this same formulation and talked about, the great task is to merge the movement for social democracy with the workers' movement, because they had started out with essentially the same problem that many of us have today, which is that the freedom, the intellectual flexibility, the courage, and the energy to wind one's way around to the determination that we should topple capitalism is something that is bred in environments that are often gate-kept by class itself. And so you end up with, at the earliest stages, a socialist movement that is not broadly reflective of the working class generally. The Social Democratic Party, despite its eventual failings, did actually for a time do a very good job embedding the SPD into the German working class. Again, not just in the unions, but in the sort of daily life of working class people in Germany. And so it's really not unidirectional either. The idea is to transform working class people into socialists by creating the organizational infrastructure that can provide a constant presence, constant opportunities for the cultivation of consciousness and leadership on the part of the working class. So it's really just about bringing the two together. That's the goal, is that there will be eventually no separation between the working class and the socialist movement. I don't know if we'll ever get there to the point where the Venn diagram is just a perfect circle, but certainly we need to move far closer than we are now in order to build a mass base strong enough to actually make gains and defend our gains in the face of inevitable opposition from capital.
Thank you, Megan. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but maybe Sam or Ursula, you would want to react to that question, or if you have any other comments you'd like to add.
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, and it reminds me actually that one of the last conversations I had with Leo was we were talking about the changes, the very rapid changes that have taken place during the pandemic in the working class organizations and among workers, and how things that seemed impossible even 2 years ago are now possible. The kind of the new ways that people have been coming together on the ground to develop community, to fill the gaps in where in the UK and I guess in the United States too, where governments have absolutely failed to deliver working people the services and support they needed during the pandemic. And the way that people came together at a local level, often using social media, often using WhatsApp groups and things like that, like at a street level in very socially mixed parts of London, like where I live in Hackney, workers, people who, working class people of many different ethnicities were actually physically coming together with what you might call college educated momentum type activists to just practically arrange food delivery services to lock down elderly people in the community and things like that. And this actually was a kind of, and Leo was enormously excited, we were talking about this, about the way that presaged the possibility for not just for new kinds of unity across different parts of the working class and different socialist groups, but also for the building of, if you like, prefigurative social models, which historically, certainly in the UK in the 20th century, were terribly important. The National Health Service in the UK was partly formed on a model that was developed in Tredegar in South Wales, where steel workers and mine workers in the 1880s came together to build a mutual aid society and hired their own doctors and built their own hospitals. And by the 1930s, when most of the population were unemployed, they were actually providing health services to 95% of the population of the town in this totally local socialist way, built, through organizations built by trade unions and built by socialists, which then became for Nye Bevan the model for the National Health Service in the UK. And you can point to lots of other examples of quite small local initiatives that are built sort of from the base up, prefigurative models that then became inspirational for this kind of social democratic welfare states of the 20th century. And what Leo and I were talking about was maybe this pandemic has created an opportunity for these kinds of new kinds of prefigurative bottom-up initiatives that bring socialists and organized workers together at a local level. And I mean, my feeling is, well, given the kind of national government we've got in the UK, that the level to do this is at the city level, that there is no basis for doing this at a national level yet. And the national state is clearly, as Leo always emphasized, the national state is absolutely critically important in all this. But nevertheless, there's an awful lot that can be done at the city level to build these organizations. And just the process of building them seems to be, going back to my experiences as a trade union activist back in the 1970s and 60s and 70s, is like the experience of winning something, the experience of building something that works is enormously empowering. Workers who have won something then go on to want to win the next thing. And so the experience of constant defeat is terrible for morale, for working class morale. So this idea of trying to build local alternative movement-based, if you like, social models seems anyway. This was like an unfinished conversation I had with Leo. I wish we'd gone further, but I share it with you in the hope that you can perhaps take that further yourselves.
Thank you. Sam, I'll let you speak just in a second. But before we have a comment by Ravi Malhotra that I'm just going to read quickly, and then you can go ahead. In 2001, Leo published my contribution within the Socialist Register, which I wrote with the American disability rights advocate, Martha Russell, and invited me to speak about it on a panel in New York. At that time, very few left publications ever considered disability. And after Martha died around 2013, I wrote a book to honor Martha. None of this would have happened had not Leo give us an opportunity. So thanks very much for this, Ravi. Now, Sam.
Yeah, I should say on that last comment that Leo was very open to this, but like everybody, we're also influenced by people around us, and his partner is a really creative and important figure around disability, and she's had a major influence on him in those questions. There's so much to say about this. Let me just flag a few things. One is that I'm really struck by the nature of the defeat over the last few decades has been about a lowering of expectations. I think that's been more important than anything else that we've lost. And the opportunities are there because of the vacuum, both in terms of what the state has done, but also the vacuum in unions. Most unions have been not great at representing their members, and this should be an opening for the left. So I think there's incredible opportunities, as Ursula was saying, but I am really concerned with the fact that opportunities really need organization to happen. I just want to emphasize that. And I also agree with Ursula that organization happens locally. That's where you organize. But the danger of not having some national campaigns is that the organization will remain fragmented. I think it is so important, for example, for the DSA, if it isn't going to lose its infrastructure that it's already built, And if it isn't going to get trapped into just local struggles, which I completely agree, we can't ignore them, they're fundamental, but we need those kinds of national campaigns to unite things and give us hope in that sense. And I just want to flag a couple of other things. This is so much a cultural issue. When I think of England, for example, and you look at the Northeast in England, which was always Labour Party, and the debates were about, are you going to go further left and the role of the communists? There was such a powerful base there. In the industry, a lot of the stewards were communists, and they were the ones who were doing a lot of this education, as the person asked. They were there, they were part of the working class and embedded. And what happened over time is that was lost. And part of the lost is because industrial structuring just took those jobs away or scared people into just having discipline, which is why I think taking on competition is going to be so important if people aren't going to be disciplined into being conservative. But the Labour Party itself played such a role in destroying that. And what it meant is that they were left vulnerable to the right. So this union question is fundamental. I have to say that, it strikes me everywhere. With Syriza had almost no union base. Corbyn, the base of unions, there were unions that supported him, but even that base was thin. The base for unions in the States, opportunities, but also thin. I'm skeptical of unions being renewed out of their own dynamic. I think a lot of the leadership has become comfortable in lowered expectations. Just blame globalization or neoliberalism or whatever, and you don't have to do much. It's a comfortable life once there's no pressure from below. But also the workers are so fragmented and are so demoralized, as both of you have said. So I actually think that one of the important things about having a party or proto-party organization is I think it's critical to renewing unions. I'm skeptical of unions being renewed out of their own dynamic. And if that can happen, then there's a new kind of dynamic that can take place. Can I say one other thing? We have time. When we think about, Megan talked very well about Leo's comments on the dangers of getting elected. One of the problems is the internal contradictions in a party. And in Syriza, for example, there's the contradiction between a party that has a faction that really wants to build the base, often not much of a faction, but some faction, and a faction that wants to reproduce itself as the governing party. And the faction that wants to primarily think about reproducing itself is usually the more powerful. It's got the legitimacy from having gotten elected, and it's got resources. And to have a party that understands that, yes, this is one thrust in the party, but there's also a thrust of getting out of parliament and getting into the base and pushing the base to challenge you, to do things for you as a state that starts transforming what the state is. And there were so many things to do in Greece, taking over land that wasn't being used, taking over cultural centers, especially in a place with a rich culture of Greece, taking over the Olympic sites that weren't being used anymore, taking over factories that were closing. And that wasn't happening. Even the hard left that was attacking Syriza was attacking them ideologically for their policies not being radical enough. But when Leo and I went and talked to the base, we found out that not much of the left was actually there at the base. So it's those internal contradictions in parties that make it so important to fight those things through so we can really have some coherence and not skip over those conflicts in what the party is. And a million more things to say. And I really appreciated both the two different dimensions that Ursula and Megan spoke on. It was terrific. I wish we had a lot more time.
Thanks, Sam. So we have a request from Rejan Ovler to speak to us. So Rejan, we're gonna turn on your microphone so you can address the audience.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. It's just some words I wanted to say for you at this opportunity. I think, well, first, I apologize for English. I hope you understand me. Beside that, I think I'm talking in the name of group of Marxist activists and academics in Brazil. When I remember here his collaboration, his active role in this group we have now consolidated called International Relations and Marxism. And he's been in Brazil a lot of times. I've been personally with Leo 2 times. He was always very kind and very open to our necessities, and was a very important person to this activist and academic group. So we have studied also together with Professor Ana Sajoro Garcia and Professor Virginia Fontes. We studied a lot his works, like, and Sam Gindin's. It's a pleasure to see you and to hear all of you here today. The book, The Making of Global Capitalism, really changed our view. I talk in the name of a group of Marxist activists here in Brazil. Really changed a lot of our conceptions, and also collaborated with the NIEP, with the Núcleo Interdisciplinar de Pesquisas sobre Marx e o Marxismo in Brazil, one of the more important groups of Marxism in Brazil. So I just wanted to thank you all for this event, and remember and thank you all who are also part, Sam Gindin, sure, part of this internationalist effort. That's it.
Thank you so much, Rejan. Thank you for sharing this. Sam, I'm gonna give you the floor in a second. I just want to let everyone know that we're gonna have to stop at 1:25 because translators need a much deserved break. But we have a few minutes left. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the panelists just a minute or two to wrap up any final thoughts you would like to share with us. So let's begin with Sam and then Ursula.
I just wanted to say to the woman who spoke about Brazil that Ana Garcia, who's part of this, she did what was either the last interview with Leo just before we went to the hospital, or the second last. He had 2 interviews that day. And Anna's probably given the best summary of the work that Leo and I have done in terms of the making of anybody. But that interview is being published in Studies in Political Economy. It'll probably be out in a week or two if anyone is interested in it. And I did want to emphasize in terms of what Anna is saying about internationalism. Sometimes internationalism is taken to be a level of solidarity in practical terms, in radical revolutionary terms, that we don't have a capacity to do right now. But the kind of internationalism that we can really do is learn from each other, because all these struggles around the world are experiments. There are people trying to discover what can be done. And sometimes we pick on one of them and try to make it into a model. And as soon as it fails, we rush over to another model. And that's something that Leo was very critical of. But he really saw it as, how can we contribute to each struggle? But above all, how can we learn from it rather than, just kind of cheerlead each of them? And this gets back to his ruthless, non-sectarian, constructive criticism that was so fundamental, as Ursula and Megan both emphasized.
Thank you, Sam. Ursula, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I don't think I really have much to add to that. Sam put it so beautifully. I think we somehow have to find a way of keeping this spirit of being open, of listening to people, of not prejudging them, of even the person you think you profoundly disagree with might have some words of wisdom that we can all learn from. and not to think we have all the answers, but to continue to collaborate with each other, communicate with each other, learn from each other, be critical in a comradely way, not in a negative way, and just try to build whatever bridges we can, intellectually, politically, and personally, to take things forward in a good way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you have said. I guess as a final note, I will say that the only reason to be a socialist is because you fundamentally believe that we share a common humanity and you would like to see our society reflect that. I mean, that's the only reason you would devote your life to this incredibly difficult political project, is because you reject the idea that the hierarchies that exist all around us are natural expressions of the differences between us. And everybody arrives at socialism. Every socialist has had some version of that same thought that brought them to the socialist movement. But what so often happens is that once we get here, we then proceed to deny each other's common humanity as frequently and as cruelly as possible, not to be too terrible to socialists who are not any worse than anybody else. But the idea that I'm trying to articulate is that if the reason that we are socialists is because we believe that we have something fundamental in common and that humans are capable of more than our society permits us to actually do and feel and be, then we've got to live that in practice as well. And from the first moment that I talked to Leo, I got the sense that he was devoted to living that in practice, to living a full and rich life as a human, not just as a socialist, and to being kind to other people as well in all the ways that Sam and Ursula have mentioned. So I aspire to emulate that. I find that enormously inspiring.
Thank you, Megan. Sam?
Can I just add one thought to where Megan and Ursula were driving to? And that relates to the attitude Leo and I both had to Sanders, because had anybody asked us, should Sanders run for the Democratic Party, we would have said, why? What are you, crazy? And one of the lessons from it is humility. And that is that Sanders did create the space, in spite of the advice we might have given about you can't do this through the Democratic Party, that actually advanced the socialist cause. And I think there's another lesson there, which is that we don't actually know how to do this. So we should be looking, never mind internationally, even at home, about all these different ways of trying to do this. And there may be a division of labor where we all try through different paths to do this, argue along the way, but respect each other. And then we eventually come through this long process to some kind of near unity on how it gets to be done. And I think it's really useful to start with this notion of, we really don't know how to do it, but we have good ideas. So I'm trying to say, we both have to respect other opinions and yet argue with them. And that really is the spirit of Leo.
Thank you very much, Sam. We'll have to stop here, but that was a really great homage for a great socialist. And thank you very much for our three panelists and to everyone for attending. And you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Bye-bye.